All right, with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. I'm Marty Hogan. I'm going to be kind of moderating this webinar today, but this is June's edition of the Council to Advance Hunting and Shooting Sports monthly webinar. This webinar is titled Tools to Understand Target Audiences. And our guest today is Dr. Zach Lowe. He is the Director of Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow and the Vice President within the Center for Conservation Leadership of the Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation. So you've got a great webinar planned for us. Just a few housekeeping tasks. We're going to take questions in the bottom right chat box, post throughout the presentation, and we will circle back to them at the end, and we'll have a little question and answer session to close out the presentation. So without further ado, Zach, take it away.
All right, thank you, Marty. I sure appreciate it. So as Marty said, typically my day-to-day is to run the CLFT program, which is Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow, and I'm not going to talk a great deal about that, but through that program, we are able to work with a lot of really talented folks from across the country talking about the value that hunting has towards wildlife conservation. And so that exposes us to some interesting questions, and we try to answer those questions for the leadership of our state and federal agencies, and R3 initiatives come up quite a bit. So we spend a lot of time talking about R3, what that means, why it's important, and how to effectively deliver these things. And through time, one of the questions that has come up is about the outdoor adoption model and how people navigate through that. And so we're pretty big fans of that. We're also really big supporters of results chains. I can tell you for our own organization's success, adhering to a results chain and thinking that through and even looking at certain steps of the outdoor recreation model have really been, important to us. And so from all of that, a few years ago, Bob Byrne, myself, and Jim Curcuruto with the National Shooting Sports Foundation said, you know, we see these examples of how a case study could really inform the adoption model. And perhaps instead of creating programming we think applies directly to the adoption model, we should really look at a couple key groups that have navigated the model successfully. So look at some of those individuals that previously were not hunters and now, after a period of time later, are hunters. And let's go back and ask them, what are the critical steps? What are the challenges? What is the path that you found your way through the model? Whether they really knew they were navigating the model or not wasn't nearly as important as finding out kind of what their perceptions and really what their story was. And our hope was that from those stories, we could make better programs. We could set up the parameters for success a little better. So, sorry, this is first time using this software, so you'll have to forgive a couple skips along the way. So I want to talk a little bit today just about the project, but mostly I want to set up to have kind of open discussion, questions, in what other form or facet we can towards the end. I will tell you that although we will go over some details of this project, you've already gotten in advance 2 different documents. The first document is on the left here. You see a recruitment of Hispanic hunters. It has the nice orangey pink sunset. So this is a 6-page document that really talks about the background of why this study was done in the first place and what we hope it offers the conservation community. And it does highlight some of the results. The next document, because this was part of a multi-state conservation grant, is a longer 30-page kind of final report that really talks about what we learned, all the various interviews that happened, the interview script that was used, and everything else. So it's a pretty detailed document. And I think it's notable for those of you that are really familiar with the R3 community and working in that from a day-to-day basis. Bob Byrne was really thoughtful in how he structured this report, in that it matches up to the finer points of the national plan. So you can go back and take this document and link it up to specific parts that have already been identified through the council and through everybody that's working on this to really see where this particular study matches and combines with the national plan. So I think that's a pretty good way to get started. So you have both of those documents already. I encourage you to take a look at them in time, and you can certainly reference anything that I'm kind of going to say in this review back to either of those individuals. So let's kind of talk about our working hypothesis. As I said before, we really thought that case study approach had real value to the R3 community, and specifically in identifying what barriers might exist and the pathways that any demographic kind of navigates through the adoption model. I also thought from my experience and from my conversations with those R3 coordinators that maybe we were lacking some good examples of a case study approach to really point to and say, boy, this has shaped how R3 programming can be improved. So we just took this on as an 18-month initiative to run this study. And from that, we started with the framework of the adoption model with the idea of not only identifying what barriers, but also just to identify what influences this particular group's participation, right? So are there things that are unique to this particular demographic? So the demographic we reached out to on this were Hispanic hunters, and we specifically wanted to look at Hispanic hunters that were successfully recruited and retained. And the way we did that, we started by screening against Hispanic surnames. So we looked back at the last U.S. Census, and we took the top 100 Hispanic surnames as identified by the U.S. Census Bureau. We then screened that against a couple select states for their license purchasing history. So we asked the states to pull those Hispanic surnames and put that in a database. And then we looked at that database, and what we really wanted to do was look back to at least 3 years ago, but preferably 7, and see if they could tell us, can you identify individuals that from their license buying history seem to be being recruited and retained into hunting? So maybe they bought a license once 7 years ago, and then 5 years ago they bought a license plus 2 big game tags, and then 2 years ago they bought the entire bundle package of every available license out there. So we were trying to get some kind of indicator of their participation rate in hunting. We also screened against age and gender and a few other things when possible, and age ended up being kind of an important final caveat that we added into these because it just gave us a little more refined lens of a study group to kind of standardize between states, because none of the states collect their license data the exact same way. So once we had a list of potential individuals to interview, the first thing we did is we made phone calls to them, and we actually asked them a set of screening questions. These were, 5 to 7 very simple questions that told us, is this a suitable candidate for the study? One of the first things we wanted to know was, did this individual, one, consider themselves a hunter, particularly a recently recruited or retained hunter, and 2, does this individual consider themselves Hispanic? Right? If they did not self-identify as either of those 2 things, then obviously they weren't the right person we were looking for the study. So you can see a full list of the screening questions in the bigger report, but I just really want to point to the fact that the screening process itself was really important in ensuring that the individuals that we invested the time with to interview and we wanted to know their stories was well vested, right? So we knew we were getting the people we wanted to for the study at that point. From then on, we tried to set up an interview time with them, and which we ran through about a 30-question script that we had kind of tested for everything from cultural sensitivity to accuracy to kind of basic translation of terms and terminology in advance. And those interviews took anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. So for the most part, Bob Byrne ran all those interviews for us in all 5 states. There were a couple instances where we had to bring in the services of an interpreter. Al Ortiz from formerly U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, got some human dimensions background, was able to offer his bilingual skills to navigate some of those conversations as well. So the interviews themselves, again, kind of the script of those is available, but it really focused on hunting initiation, what activities they were participating in currently with hunting, and we tried to have kind of an unfolded conversation then about what their perceived or realized barriers were, not only for them as individuals, but we also just asked about the Hispanic population as a whole, if they could help identify or at least offer what their thoughts about some of the barriers might be. The partner states we looked at were really defined kind of by 3 key things. One is that they really needed to have robust license databases. I think it's worth noting at this point that at the time we did this study, starting in 2015, only about half the states had a license database that could be mined or searched in the parameters I just described. And so the reason that's critical is things as simple as asking for a mobile telephone number. Perhaps your state can't require that, but in the days of electronic license databases and online purchases, you can at least have that as an option, right? That they need to put a mobile number in there, or if they want to put a mobile number in there, because something as simple as just not having telephone numbers would preclude some states from reproducing this methodology, because in order for a case study to really work, you need to have that one-on-one interview process. The other kind of overlying method that we were looking at in which states participated and which didn't was geographic distribution. So we didn't want all southeastern states. We didn't want all New England states. So we did the best we could to kind of spread out the states we sampled among, particularly among states that had a higher general Hispanic population. What that meant was we ended up with Arizona, Texas, Florida, Utah, and Michigan as our 5 study states. All in all, there were probably 12 to 13 states that kind of rose to the top of the possibilities list with this, but these are the 5 that we ended up. So to give you a little bit of an idea of kind of the throughput, it was a pretty intense and selective screening process. But in reality, tens of thousands of license sales data were initially analyzed to produce these state-specific lists. And then we further screened those lists to ensure that interviews were conducted only with targeted subjects. And we really wanted that to be Hispanic hunters that had been recently retained into the hunting culture. To give you an idea what that looks like, the graphic here is a little compressed, but you can see by state, the first number is how many individuals could the state identify that met our parameters. So the top 100 surnames that had a license buying history that would suggest they were recently recruited and retained. And so you can see it's pretty variable across the way there. For instance, Arizona was very refined in what they produced and got us 365 very targeted individuals. By comparison, Florida had 4,324 individuals, and that's because a lot of their license sales is also combined with fishing license database as well. And so we had to sort through what was hunting, what was fishing. Some of those are combined. And not to go through all of these individually, but what that says is there's a lot of variability from state to state. And so we had to have a methodology that allowed for some flexibility, but still standardize the state data at least into some categorical chunks that could be compared among and between states. So another interesting point here is if you look at the second line in gray, and I think I'm highlighting this, is that the attempted contacts to screen and interview. So the number above that, let's look at Arizona to start with, 365 of 365 names. It took us 70 attempts to get to our target of 15 interviews per state. So we worked with a couple human dimensions folks across the country and really asked them at what point are we likely to reach saturation. So the idea that another interview doesn't necessarily enrich the information you're getting at that point. And most of them agreed that, boy, if you can get 15 per state, that's a really good target to have. Also knowing that this was a fairly short-term project that had I won't say a limited budget, but it wasn't an endless budget either. So we were pretty happy with getting 15 in each individual state. So you can see in some instances it took 70 attempts to get the interviews we need. And other instances it took as much as 160 like in Michigan. And that's largely a function of how well you can mine your data down to a useful form. So some basic findings, and again, this is all a little more detailed. I just wanted to relate this back to kind of the stages of the adoption model. You know, many Hispanics are not aware of the opportunities available to them or how to get started, and we made some recommendations based on our conversations that creating a simple bilingual summaries of steps necessary to become a hunter may be one way to assist with that. Again, at the interest stage, one of the findings, many Hispanics are interested in going and hunting. So not only did the Hispanics we interviewed state a high degree of instance, they also thought that now that they had become hunters, or that since they were hunters, that they thought this was an activity that would likely be very, very appealing to other Hispanics as well. And so there were some questions then followed up about, well, what are some effective ways to maybe reach out? What are some messages? And from the individuals we spoke to, the idea that promoting hunting as a means of getting outside, providing food for the family to have fun, and a good way to learn new skills. That there also is maybe some opportunity here to create some form of a Hispanic social support system, and that can be done at the national level, the state level, or local level, but that there's probably the opportunity here to kind of help galvanize this group at least a little bit with kind of a shared community to communicate with. At the trial stage, you know, pretty common among, I think, most new hunters, improve accessibility of hunter education courses is important, and then specifically in or near Hispanic communities. I'll circle back to this a little bit towards the end, but the in or near Hispanic communities, I think, is an important bit of background information to consider. Interestingly enough, we reached out to some partners, specifically those at Calcoming, about what's the reality of the use of Spanish versions of hunter education materials. And although they certainly produce in full their hunter education manual, it's disproportionately probably not used as much as you might guess. And so some of that is just a simple awareness that maybe we need to let the Hispanic community know that those resources exist and house those, if nothing else, electronically so that they're kind of readily available. Again, in the trial stage, many Hispanics may be interested but have difficulty in finding mentors and information. Again, some opportunity to create an innovative Hispanic social support system and then promote access to hunting information within Hispanic communities. So what we did learn from this, and I think what was really telling to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation, and then our conversations with folks at the council, was that, you know, at the end of the day, the Hispanic community faces very similar challenges as that of any other group of new hunters. They absolutely need assistance in understanding state laws and requirements, the steps necessary to become a hunter, and then what potential hunting opportunities are available to them at a local level. What we were really hoping to find or to identify was, are there things unique to this particular demographic? Are there things unique to Hispanic hunters that we should be aware of and maybe begin to plan for within our offerings of R3 programs and outreach? And so for some Hispanics, specific barriers to engagement in hunting may loom larger. And this really comes down to cultural awareness and our ability as a profession to communicate to them are really key. And so what our general conclusions were, and I would put the preface on this and the caveat that these are the lessons learned from the Hispanic hunters within the 5 states that we sampled. Had we sampled 5 other states, the stories and the information would likely have had some nuanced differences, right? I think the vast majority of it would still apply, but this is just what the 75 hunters that we spoke to had to tell us in return based on our questions. So, I think this summarizes it very well. So yes, all new hunters face a variety of challenges as they navigate the model. But for Hispanics who participate in this case study, some of these challenges may loom larger, such as language barriers. Some participants identified the rate of acculturation, education, social background, and or immigration status as important considerations. And we go into that and give some examples in the full report. Additional obstacles that may limit participation by Hispanics were stated as follows. One is expense associated with buying equipment, travel to and from hunting areas, or acquiring a lease. So all things that are kind of related to the equipment and access to the resource. Having access to hunting equipment or knowledge of how to purchase the correct equipment. And so ensuring that we have retailers and vendors and a social network that kind of welcomes and addresses Hispanic members into the buying process. Access to or knowledge of places to hunt, so knowing it's an option, knowing what resources they need to seek out, maybe to get a hunting atlas in the state, to find out where public land offerings are, to put in for a state or federal run draw, those type of items. And then I think the last one is certainly notable and kind of unique at the cultural level, that there is some fear of additional scrutiny by law enforcement personnel if they inadvertently violate a game law. Now, we did not hear this across the board from everyone we interviewed, but certainly it was a noted piece of concern among some of the individuals we talked to. I think it's worth pointing out here, too, and where I said circling back to the earlier about the idea of having Hispanic or having hunter education courses offered in Hispanic communities. There has already been some other research done by NSSF and others that really suggest there is some social stigma about firearms, particularly among first-generation Hispanics, that we as a community should be aware of. And that says that, among new immigrant Hispanic families, there is a concern about the ownership of a firearm, and that perhaps only criminals or bad guys or people looking to get in trouble really need to own firearms, and that it may take a generation of kind of acculturation and understanding for some individuals to be in a social position at home where owning a firearm, possessing a firearm, bringing a firearm in and out of the house on a regular basis, to go to the range, to take to the field, to participate in hunting, that could be kind of a social, cultural barrier that we need to be aware of. So next steps, and as Samantha and I talked about this, we looked at this study and said, okay, here's some good information. Here's a good example of a case study applied to the adoption model that has applications to the R3 community. So what are the possible next steps that we may be able to do here? So what we would offer is that if you have a specific interest in Hispanic recruitment, retention, reactivation within your state or within your region or within your kind of area and domain, the study we did is easily reproduced and it's kind of ready-made for the R3 effort. So you could take what we did, apply those same methodologies, and very quickly figure out if you had a database that was robust enough to do this, if you have the needed people to do it, and we could give you a very good estimate in short order of what it takes to do that. So the council may be able to help with that, our research team, our partners may be able to help with that, but we need to know if there's any interest for that out there. And if there's not, no problem, right? We've got the report and the publication out there for those that want to use it on their own. But if there's some community lift that can be done through kind of shared effort, we would at least like to try to get the ball rolling on that. And Samantha can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was sent out to you guys probably in advance or as a quick follow-up on the survey about today's podcast. So you can kind of let us know if maybe that applies to you. But I also wanted to talk about and invite the team of folks that worked on this to really talk about case studies in general. We chose to reach out to the Hispanic hunters as our demographic of choice. But this same process and procedure could easily be applied to almost any demographic that you have data for. So if you would really wanted to look at males age 22 to 28 and their license buying trends, or families, right, based on kind of last name or shared address, many licensed databases would be able to tell you of people that share this common address, how many licenses are they buying, right? And so you could then begin to extrapolate that to, are we trying to work on a families of field initiative? What's critical there is that you have to have the license data. It's an incredibly powerful tool, but you've got to have some key categorical data in order to execute that tool. So maybe changing gears slightly away from this specific study and just talking about R3 target audiences. So the things that we learned through doing this is really a question of, do you have the tools to do these things? And this is exactly what the council and others are working towards, right? So many of us have R3 initiatives, and we're trying to put resources to that. So let's really try to identify what are some of the key tools and skill sets that are going to be required to run one of these case studies and make it effective so it really impacts your programming. So the first is, we've got a pretty good conceptual structure, right? So we've got this model out there that helps us understand and define how individuals would adopt and become successfully recruited or retained in this process of becoming a hunter. So that's really good, and we begin to test that model. And again, I point back to having very disciplined results chains and referring to the model as a real key to success in that. I just can't say enough about how beneficial that's been to the CLFT program and how we've been able to kind of really improve how we do and what we do through that process. The other part is license data. So most all of us have access to license data, particularly those at a state agency do, or we have partners at a state agency that could help us define maybe the geographic region we're looking to make improvements. But the details within that license data, those are really critical in determining if you can mine out or further select for a specific target demographic. Some things like gender, age, address, those are pretty easy to determine based on our existing license data sets. Other things, though, maybe are not and would limit us from looking at a particular demographic or contacting that particular demographic. I mentioned that cell phones, a surprising number of states don't even ask for cell phone data, even if it's voluntary, right? But a certain number of states don't ask for it, nor do they require it. Surprisingly enough, gender is not always required. And so I think I'm probably preaching to the choir with this group that some refinement of our license data is really important. Even if you've made those changes already, the other important thing to remember for recruitment and retention information is it's not just a single time frame that becomes important, but it's multiple repeated measures over time. So we had to go back to states that had electric data all the way back for 5 to 7 years. And that instantly began to eliminate some states that may be doing things better or improved now, but they hadn't been for 5 or 7 years. So we couldn't really look at license buying trends because their data system, their license data system had changed once or twice or 3 times during that time as they were trying to kind of sort through this. So those are the first two that most people should have access to. So check and check on those. The questions, I think, for maybe each of your individual projects, if a case study approach is of interest to you, can you clearly define the demographic? And does that come with available, searchable, and categorical data? And so I would encourage you to think about that first and foremost. So what's the target audience you're after, and can that audience be defined through these demographic data, right? The second part, and I think this is absolutely crucial, and the reason why the National Shooting Sports Foundation really helped on a heavy lift with this, why we contracted with Bob Byrne to help make sure the interviews were going smoothly, is the discipline and time to track and relate this to a results chain. So you really need to think about the whole process from kind of start to front before you ever reach out to the first would-be case study to start to hear their story. The other issue of time, right, and perhaps the reason, again, two kind of NGOs got involved with this is because we recognize time is limited for a lot of state agencies. And so by testing the waters and putting the horsepower and the resources into this, we were able to join forces with state agencies and the power of their license database to do this case study. But the idea that you need to have kind of time and cultural resources to develop the needed methodology. And again, that all has to be done before you reach out to that first would-be case study participant. And then I think probably the one that can be most challenging is you run the case study, you reach out to individuals, you collect these rich, unique stories. Ultimately, do you have within your agency or within your organization or within your network of partners, do you have the ability to change your program offerings? So do you actually have not only a better mousetrap at the end of the case study or a more informed way to navigate the model, but do you also have then the ability to make recommendations and see the changes through into the program you offer, which is all part of the results chain, right? Which is all part of that feedback loop that takes information at various steps throughout the process and relates it back to your original core objectives and then repeats that process until you get a refined product that you're comfortable with. From that, and Samantha, I'll take your cue on this. I know we've got Bob Byrne on the line. I think Jim Curcuruto is also from the audience. Those were two other folks that were helping with the lift of this project. But I'd like to be able to answer any questions, open it up for any discussion, and find out, are there other relatables that this group's interested in with our time today?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Yeah, we're going to open it up to questions here. Please, everybody, if you have a question, type it in that bottom right chat box. As you guys are kind of submitting your questions here, we got a couple questions kind of queued up for you, but we'll start with this one. In some states, you had to contact over 100 people for 15 interviews. That's a pretty low conversion and shows that it might take more work than might than one might expect to get those complete interviews to understand your target audiences. Do you think this could be a base metric for all projects with other target audiences?
I don't think, so if the question is, does that ratio of, contact 100 and expect to get 15 interviews work out, I think the caution with that is probably more based on the quality of the license data that you have. So the more refined the data, and I would point to Arizona, who was really able to hone in on what key aspects we were targeting. It took 70 contacts to get to our 15 individuals, versus Michigan, who didn't even have a requirement for their mobile cell phone data that went back as far as we needed license buying history. So as a result, that one key variable in the license data really set the stage for whether we got to our targeted number more or sooner, right, or more efficiently, or whether we had to wade through a lot of screening calls and very quickly identify who we were calling that wasn't our target audience. Did that answer the question, you think, Marty?
Yeah, I think it did.
Hey, Zach, this is Bob. If I could jump in there a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, Bob.
Part of that is just the society we live in. When you're calling a mobile number, and depending on who owns that mobile number, they may or may not set up as an email or a voicemail. They may or may not have a greeting. They may or may not respond to a voicemail at all. So that conversion rate, it will be highly variable, I suspect, with the target audience that you're talking to. And I think Zach is correct, is the quality of the information you start with will help do that. But it's really not that hard. I mean, those phone calls we had, I had a sort of a basic introductory script that was about a minute and a half that I left a voicemail and moved on to the next one. And so making the calls was not necessarily that big of a lift or a burden, even though it sounds like a very high rejection rate. I suspect that conversion rate is very comparable to other studies of this type. And so that wasn't what necessarily took the time. Writing up the reports and going back and listening to the interviews on tape-recorded interviews to make sure I got my impressions correct took far longer than actually making the calls itself.
Yeah, and Marty, I would add too, just from kind of my outside in, to be clear, Bob was the one that organized the interviews and conducted them, and so we had that kind of standardized across all states. But I also think that your success rate, as far as how many people you had to call versus until you got your target number, also would have a lot to do with the particular customer, if you will, that you're after. If you are trying to contact, so for example, if you are trying to contact people that you believe to have become successfully recruited and retained as avid hunters, if you call and leave them a message that says, I want to talk to you about hunting in your path in, that this is something those individuals obviously are passionate about and are probably more likely to return that phone call than if you took that same demographic group that did not buy licenses, right? So that similar individual from a demographic perspective but did not have the license buying history and said, hey, I would like to know if you think you might be interested in becoming a hunter because we saw you bought a kayak last year, right? Or you registered at one of our state parks or whatever it might be. I think the individual's motivations and their avidity would likely determine how many callbacks you get as well, just from an outside perspective.
Awesome. I think that was a good answer to that one. Next question. what were some other target audiences you were considering when planning this project?
Yeah, so you know, we had considered kind of looking at where we see some trends within R3. We had talked this through before we wrote the grant. You know, is there some kind of late career, so to speak, so 22, 23 and above, where we see about a third of those people come into hunting later in life, so non-traditional routes in. We had also looked at, you know, maybe there's some information the BOW program might have, but in reality, to do it across the nation, the Hispanic demographic was really appealing because we could link in things like Census Bureau data. We had all 50 states to at least draw from to try to see if we could get enough congruency among 5 states' license data in the long term to kind of standardize results. So it became somewhat of a numbers game, but also I will say, me personally, as we work with R3 folks and just agency folks from across the country, whether it's better engagement in hunting, angling, trapping, or just general engagement with the outdoors, it seems as a community we're spending a fair amount of time and money and interest in better engaging with the Hispanic community as they're a significant and growing demographic. So it was an obvious choice, I think, to many of us that were leading this project, and was really our first choice for this grant.
Alrighty, great. And yeah, remember, if you have any questions, just type them in that box. We'll get them answered for you guys. So, in your experience, can your audience be too specific here? Tom Wilcox gives an example of like families in the age range of 18 to 35 in Virginia. Is that too specific?
I don't think so. Matter of fact, I think the more specific you can be and still kind of get at least enough critical mass to inform, the better off you are, right? And the more measurable your outcomes become. Because you have a very specific target audience, I think particularly if you can link those to characteristics that predefine someone as likely to become a hunter, personally, I think that's great. I'll also defer to kind of Bob and or Sam, even if you've got some thoughts on it. But certainly from a case study standpoint, the more specific you can be and link that to your desired outcomes, the better.
So John asked, so can we safely extrapolate from those 14 to 15 individuals the rest of our Hispanic populations who may or may not be hunters?
No. No, that the thing to remember with that 14 to 15 individuals, one is that was kind of a rule of thumb assumed saturation number, right? And we generated that from a couple different human dimensions folks that said, yeah, that's about the point. 12 to 15, that's when you're going to reach saturation, asking these very specific questions, right? So the more specific questions, the more refined your screening process, the fewer individuals perhaps you need to kind of reach critical mass. But remember, these 15 individuals per state really can only apply or be extrapolated to other individuals that also meet those screening questions that we ask. So what does that extrapolate to? That extrapolates to people that self-identify as being hunters and self-identify as being Hispanic, right? It just says this is how those individuals successfully navigated the model. What I think it's up to us then as practitioners about is how do those experiences, how does the story they told us kind of in this quantified manner, right? This repeated set of questions that allows us to quantify their experience. What does that then tell us about effective programming, right? And the other really cool thing about case studies is once you've engaged this group of people, nothing would say then that after you feel like, if you feel like you've created better programming because of your case study outreach efforts, nothing says then that you couldn't reach right back out to that same group and even incentivize them to say, hey, we think this is a better method. Could you give us a little feedback on that, right? Could you just answer these 2 or 3 real-time questions about do you think this embodies the changes and the needed improvements? So it really creates a communication opportunity and it's a broader chance for engagement.
John or Matt, if I could, or Marty, can I jump in there a little bit as well?
Yeah.
So going back to John's question, a couple things. One, there is no single one Hispanic culture or community. The Hispanics that have origins from Mexico are different than those that come from Guatemala, that are different from those who come from Cuba or those who come from Venezuela. And so all of them come from a very different place. And so each state has a different mix of Hispanics folks, and so even within that, and that's the, I guess, the value and or downside of qualitative research. It's small numbers of people that you're looking to get general impressions of, general themes of, and if you look at this and compare it to a focus group, and you have 15 people sitting around the table, well, is that 15 people that sit around the table representative of the rest of the folks that are in your target population? Probably close, at least within the parameters that, as Zach was talking about, of the parameters that you set up. But can you extrapolate it even further and start putting quantitative numbers and statistically and analyze it? No, you cannot. And so, but it still gives you, I believe, very valid themes to explore further, valid themes to that they've identified particularly as barriers or as some sort of hindrances for their participation. And one of the overarching recommendations of the national plan is that you develop a program, you evaluate that program, you readapt your program, you evaluate your program. So it's a constant adaptive management to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the target audience that you're trying to recruit. And so it doesn't matter whether they're Hispanics or non-Hispanics, you still want to have this iterative process of making sure that the participants are driving what the content is that you're offering. And that's a critical element. And then you keep evaluating to make sure you're hitting their needs.
Great. Perfect. So do you guys think this is accurate? A great application of this model is to get to know a target audience before you plan or design an R3 effort.
Yes, I think that's an accurate way to look at how this, I think that's the first step, yes.
Great. You guys talked about a 45-minute call per interview and a list of 30 or more questions to cover it with people. Is that the common amount? Is there a limit of what type of information one can cover in these interviews?
Yeah, I think you have to have reasonable expectations in the amount of time someone, the law of averages, right? How long is someone likely to spend on the phone? And for those of you that have ever done survey work, you know the biggest challenge is we probably started with a script with 75 questions, right? But you have to pare that down. You have to kind of eliminate the need-to-know information from the nice-to-know information. And then I think the other real challenge is before we ever piloted this among a test state or an individual, we reached out within the natural resources community to some Hispanic employees in Texas, some within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, some friends of friends, and said, hey, we're wanting to test this and send this out. Can you at least give us some feedback as to if this is kind of culturally accurate and sensitive, right? Are we communicating effectively with this particular demographic? And so I think you need to kind of test it in its entirety before you ever kind of run it in real time.
Marty, if I can add a few more. Generally speaking, once you got someone interested in talking about their hunting experience and their background, it was not difficult to add additional questions, exploratory questions, have them explain in greater detail what they meant by this or what that situation was. The initial contact was by far the most difficult. But again, there were personalities that would be very difficult to engage, most of the people I talked to were after a few questions, were indeed willing to engage and talk very freely and tell us their story. But there were a few that would answer yes, no, and you couldn't get them engaged or had difficulty. So again, the accuracy of the question and is this, can you explore it further? Qualitative information has lots of biases, and that's why it has very limited use in terms of, or its use, not limited use, its use is limited in formulating other hypotheses, giving you these theories or themes to explore further, getting sort of a general assessment of where that community is. And so, again, asking follow-up questions, I did not find any difficulty in doing so. In fact, once I got some of the folks talking, they talked quite a bit and very freely.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. We're going to wrap this up here, unless anybody else has some last-minute questions, which I don't see anybody typing. So thank you guys very much. You'll see that Sam sent a survey out to you guys to take. We just want to make sure that we're hitting the right topics, covering the right information for all you guys, making them the best, most informative webinars that we can. Anyways, Zach, thank you very much for doing this presentation. We really appreciate it. We're going to be back again next month with another webinar. Stay tuned for that. Keep an eye out on the R3 newsletter, which came out today, on what to look forward to in the future. So thanks, guys. Have a great rest of the week, everybody.
Thank you.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated.